Hello and thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Here's a look at some of the stories we're covering for you today. Thanksgiving is just one day away and President Biden and the First Lady are ready for the holidays. With the holiday season and Thanksgiving upon us, we go beyond the turkey and the football games to remember what the holiday of Thanksgiving is truly about. We also get some advice on how to handle some of those so-called divisive topics while gathering with family. The Biden administration, in a bid to lower gas prices, is releasing an unprecedented amount of oil from the nation's emergency stockpile, tens of millions of barrels. How soon will Americans see lower gas prices, and how long will the short-term fix last? Thanksgiving is just one day away, and the White House is participating in some of the holiday traditions. Hundreds of troops lined up at Fort Bragg, North Carolina on Monday. There they greeted President Biden and the First Lady for an early Thanksgiving celebration.
Folks, I want to thank not only you warriors, I want to thank your families because they stand and wait. And I know how hard it is to have someone who's not at the table on a holiday.
After the brief remarks, the President and the First Lady helped dish out some stuffing. Biden's predecessors have mostly traveled to visit troops in either Iraq or Afghanistan around the holiday. But with the combat mission concluding this year, Biden chose to stay in the United States. On Tuesday, the president left for Nantucket, just off the coast of Massachusetts, to spend Thanksgiving with his family. Before leaving the White House, Biden pardoned 2 turkeys, peanut butter and jelly. In the metro Washington, D.C. area, Thanksgiving celebrations have already begun with the Montgomery County Thanksgiving Day Parade over the weekend. The parade was canceled last year due to the pandemic, and this year the event is the only Thanksgiving parade in the greater Washington, D.C. region. Thanksgiving is a centuries-old holiday that dates back prior to the founding of our country. Traditionally, it was a time for family to gather and reflect on life's blessings and give thanks to our Creator. To discuss the historical significance of Thanksgiving, we have America's Constitution coach and founder of Patriot Academy, Rick Green. Rick, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Hey, Steve, my pleasure. Good to be with you.
Now, Rick, let's talk about Thanksgiving. Give us some historical perspective, if you could. I think we tend to lose sight, and many of us never even really know what the holiday stands for. What does Thanksgiving mean to you?
Well, you know, for us, it's a great time to stop and thank God for all of the blessings in life, but specifically that we live in a free land, that we live in a nation where we get to make the decisions, or at least we're supposed to be able to make the decisions about our family and our careers and all of those things. So it's just a great time to pause and thank God for those blessings. That's the rich tradition here in America, and frankly, even before America was formed. I mean, we have Thanksgiving celebrations that took place before the famous one in 1621. That's the one we all typically think of. But, I mean, you can go back to the 1500s and Paladoro Canyon in Texas with Coronado and other examples, in Jamestown. But obviously the Thanksgiving celebration with the Pilgrims, that's one we typically think of, where they joined with the Indians and had a great feast and athletic competition and all those things. But they definitely were thanking God for getting them through that nearly impossible winter. And then we did it all throughout the Revolutionary War. The Continental Congresses had days of proclamation, other examples in government. But, of course, Lincoln's the one that officially did that 1863 proclamation that really is remarkable when you think about what was happening in the country, how awful things were, and yet he was willing to stop and say, let's thank God for all of our blessings. Boy, that's a unique perspective that he had.
Now, I'm not saying this in a facetious way, truly. I mean, I think there's a lot of us that don't really know that Thanksgiving is more than eating just turkey and watching football. And I don't think it's necessarily just because you're a Christian that you're saying that, but it is really a time to reflect and show our thanks to God and our Creator.
And I love what you just pointed out. You know, listen, people of all faith get to stop and pause and say, man, we're blessed. And frankly, even those that don't believe in God get to say, you know, look, I won the lottery by being able to live where I live and have the freedoms that I have. But in our nation's history, and the tradition, of course, has been to thank God Almighty. Lincoln's proclamation that he did in 1863 kind of started a trend. Presidents after that for 75 years did the same thing. And then in 1941 is when Congress actually made it official, and we have our official Thanksgiving holiday.
Now, Rick, I want to ask you about how the country is so politically polarized right now. And when we visit our relatives this Thanksgiving, how we might sit on different sides of the aisle. There are many households that I'm sure are saying not to talk about politics, but that sounds like more of something you would hear people say coming from a communist country and not in America. So how can we maintain our dignity as freedom-loving Americans during the holidays, but yet without turning the family gathering into a hostile political debate?
Yeah, I would throw out two things, Steve, because I think you're right on, and I think a lot of families are feeling exactly what you just described. The two things I would throw out is number one, just from a practical perspective, we used to really value civil discourse. We used to value the idea that we could sit around the table and talk about these things and disagree, but still love each other and have that discussion. So I would say bring that up. Say, listen, if we don't have civil discourse, we're going to have civil war. I mean, that's really what happens. When you can't talk about things and have the discussion, it leads to violence. So let's avoid the violence by being able to have the discussion. And then the second thing, I'd throw out Patrick Henry's speech. You know, everybody remembers give me liberty or give me death. But at the very beginning of that speech, he said, according to the magnitude of the subject, ought to be the freedom of the debate. The magnitude of the subject right now, is our country going to stay together? Are we going to stay the United States of America? Are we going to stop the violence in the streets? Are we going to come? That's a pretty, I would say that's the magnitude of that subject is huge. So the freedom of the debate also should be big. We should be able to have those discussions. So start by saying, hey, Uncle so-and-so, or I love you. And I want to be able to have civil discourse with you today. Can we just talk about things? And I want to hear what you have to say. I want to say what I believe. And maybe we'll sharpen each other's countenance here, and we'll both walk away better able to defend our positions. And maybe even I'll change my position based on what you say. That's what civil discourse is all about.
Rick Green, thank you.
Hey, Steve. Thank you, sir.
And President Biden updated Americans this week on the economy and inflation. He announced a short-term fix for the surging gas prices, releasing barrels of oil from the emergency stockpile.
An effort that will span the globe in its reach and ultimately reach your corner gas station, God willing. The big part of the reason Americans are facing high gas prices is because oil-producing countries and large companies have not ramped up the supply of oil quickly enough to meet the demand.
Biden also says that his climate change agenda is not hurting the oil and gas industry. The Department of Energy will release 50 million barrels of the emergency stockpile, which has around 600 billion barrels of oil stored up. Upon Biden's request, 5 countries, China, India, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom, will also release their oil stockpiles.
We're hopeful that prices will be stabilized and start to move down. We are not saying that there is going to be some dramatic difference.
Usually, stockpiles are released only under dire circumstances, for instance, during war or after a severe hurricane or other natural disaster. But this time, it is intended to bring prices down. Joining us to discuss how President Biden's actions will impact Americans, NTD's Melina Wisecup. So, Melina, how soon will Americans see these lower prices, and how long is this short-term fix expected to hold?
Steve, the experts I've spoken to say we really just have to wait to see how the market responds to this as to whether or not the prices will go down by a bit. And if we do see a decrease, it won't be by much, somewhere between 5 and 15 cents a gallon. Now, we have been looking throughout the morning to see if there have been any changes so far. It doesn't look like there has been any so far, but these changes, these decreases could trickle in over the next couple of weeks, so we'll just have to wait and see for that. Let's hear what the experts are saying.
50 million barrels is about 2.5 days of U.S. oil consumption. So it's not sizable, and it's not going to be long lasting. It's going to be a short-term impact.
Right now in the marketplace, due to supply chain security and rising costs at gas stations, even though you might be able to get wholesale prices down, there seems to be a lot of problems at the retail sector.
Melina, and there are reports that OPEC may combat this supply surge with cutting back on production even more. So what are experts in the oil industry saying about the possibility of this retaliation from OPEC? And if they do cut back on production, will that undermine some of the steps Biden is taking now to lower gas prices?
Yes, Steve, so those reports are surfacing, and if OPEC does choose to respond in this way by cutting back on their own production, it could lead to this effort by the Biden administration having little to no impact at all on gas prices. The OPEC group is meeting next week to discuss these plans, so we'll see how they choose to respond to this. Steve?
Now, Melina, these higher prices are really giving room for the administration to push for their green energy policies, saying that it's time to move to cleaner energy so we don't have to depend so much on OPEC and Russia and fossil fuels in general. What's the political messaging around this issue at the moment?
Yeah, the Democrats are using this moment, these high prices, as a way to push more for these clean energy policies. The Energy Secretary was asked specifically about the relatively low domestic production here in the U.S., and she said that it was because of the pandemic. Now, of course, Republicans argue that these high prices are the direct result of the Biden administration's energy policies, such as shutting down the Keystone Pipeline, plans to ban public leasing for oil and gas production here in the U.S. And then you have Manchin, which is kind of in his own category, who says that he does agree that this temporary fix is a good Band-Aid for now, but he's overall he's upset with the Biden administration's energy policies, calling them, quote, short-sighted. Manchin also called on Biden to restart the Keystone Pipeline. Steve?
Melina, and President Biden this week also gave an update on the economy. How's the recovery looking now?
Unemployment has fallen for the 8th week in a row, and we're down to about 4.6% right now. The jobless claim sharply dropped to a level not seen in about 50 years, so that's a good sign. Biden also says that the supply chain congestion is easing and that major retailers tell him their shelves will be stocked for the holidays. Steve?
Thanks for that, Melina. And Republican Congresswoman Lauren Boebert introduced a bill to stop federal payments that the Biden administration wants to give out to illegal border crossers that had been separated from their children. The Congresswoman introduced the bill after reports that some illegal immigrants could receive up to $450,000 in compensation. Her bill prevents the U.S. Treasury from making payments for court settlements related to the enforcement of the Trump-era zero-tolerance policy on illegal immigration. Italy's antitrust authority has fined U.S. tech giants Amazon and Apple for more than $225 million. Amazon and Apple were alleged to be involved in an anti-competitive cooperation in the sale of Apple and Beats branded products. This was in violation of European Union rules and affected competition on prices. The authority imposed a fine of about $77 million on Amazon and about $151 million on Apple. Both Apple and Amazon said that they do plan to appeal the fines. And coming up, CDC data shows that more people have been killed by the CCP virus this year than last year, despite the access to vaccines. And vaccine mandates continue to impact people and businesses across America. Congressman Andy Harris is also a medical doctor, and we sit down with him to break it all down. A state-level bill was just passed in New Hampshire's House of Representatives. Could this path be a model for the country when it comes to freeing private businesses from becoming the vaccine police? We'll have that and more in just a moment. Vice President Kamala Harris announced on Monday that the Biden administration will be investing $1.5 billion from the COVID-19 relief package to support the healthcare workforce in what she calls high-risk and underserved communities. According to the White House, the investment is designed to address the shortage of doctors, nurses, and behavioral health providers in rural areas, minority, and other underserved communities. The funds will go to the National Health Service Corps and Nurse Corps, as well as the Substance Use Disorder Treatment and Recovery programs. It will offer scholarships and loan repayment for healthcare students and workers if they pledge to work in underserved and high-risk communities. And according to the CDC, the CCP virus has killed more people this year than in 2020. According to CDC data, nearly 378,000 people have died of COVID-19 in 2020. And as of this year, roughly 393,000 people have died from the virus. That's approximately 14,000 more people who have perished from the CCP virus this year than in 2020, despite having access to the vaccines. New COVID infections are now on the rise in 38 states. Health officials have been bracing for the possibility of a surge in cases over the winter. Nearly a third of new cases are coming from the Midwest, with Michigan and Minnesota reporting the most cases per capita. Meanwhile, the state of Florida is currently reporting the least amount of CCP virus cases in the country on a per capita basis. And as the cases continue to surge in the United States, the World Health Organization warned that Europe could see another 700,000 COVID-19 deaths by March. It would make the total death toll in Europe reach close to 2.2 million by next spring. Congressman Andy Harris is a medical doctor representing the state of Maryland's 1st District. When it comes to the issue of vaccine mandates, the congressman says that it is a complete overreach of basic liberties. Here's a look at part of our sit-down with the congressman. Congressman Harris, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Absolutely. Good to be with you.
Now, are these mandates right now with the Fifth Circuit, is it going to apply to federal workers or private sector as well?
Well, my understanding is the Fifth Circuit one is mainly has to do with the OSHA standards, so it's the private. But I think by very close extension, what you can say is that it's unclear that Jacobson, for instance, gave the U.S. government the ability to impose vaccine mandates. It gave states the ability, but I'm not sure it gave the government the ability. And I think that case is also, those cases will also have to be going up to the Supreme Court for a ruling on whether the federal workers and federal contractors can in fact be required. I think the Supreme Court's going to weigh in, and I think that this clearly goes beyond the ability of OSHA to regulate the workplace. There's no question about it. This is completely unprecedented, a total abuse of regulatory authority.
Now, Congressman, I want to ask you, how concerned are you that these mandates may be coming for children?
I'm very, very concerned, especially the 5 to 11-year-olds. There is no long-term safety data. Obviously, if you're a high-risk 5 to 11-year-old, it's great that these vaccines are available, but to take the next step in some jurisdictions actually beginning to require these in 5 to 11-year-olds goes well beyond what should be done.
The Biden administration has asked the U.S. Sixth Court of Appeals to reject an order that was granted by the Fifth Circuit and to reinstate its OSHA vaccine mandate for private businesses with 100 or more employees. Several lawsuits that challenge the OSHA rule have been combined into one and sent to the Ohio-based Sixth Circuit. The Biden administration argues that the Fifth Circuit panel erroneously interpreted OSHA's mandate, adding that delaying the enforcement would, quote, likely cost many lives per day. The OSHA rule was published earlier in November and immediately triggered a series of lawsuits from states, individuals, and businesses across the country. The Fifth Circuit ruling described the mandate as, quote, fatally flawed and halted it for pending adequate judicial review. The New Hampshire House of Representatives has passed an amendment to a bill which could be a way for private businesses to legally have an out from having to enforce vaccine mandates. Here to discuss the bill with us, we have New Hampshire State Representative Melissa Blazek. Melissa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Now, Representative, you and your colleagues have just passed a rather significant bill in your state, the state of New Hampshire, with exemptions for businesses so that they will not have to mandate the vaccines. Tell us a little bit about this and what this bill here aims to do.
So it has gone through step number one. The committee passed this bill. It is sort of a Hail Mary bill, if you will, because unlike our regular session doesn't begin until January. That's when the bill making process would normally begin, but we kind of stuck in a fast-tracked bill here to get something done as quickly as possible because obviously deadlines are looming. And yes, this bill would exempt anyone from receiving a COVID-19 vaccine if they object for reasons of conscience, religious exemptions, or medical exemptions, including prior infection.
Interesting. Now, much of the discussion around these vaccine mandates seems to have become hyper-politicized. Did you see any bipartisan support for this bill?
Well, you're right. It is a very hyper-partisanized issue, which is a shame because this should be an issue of liberty and science and reason, but that's not where we've ended up. However, this actually was a bipartisan bill. One Democrat on the committee did vote in favor of this bill. she might end up being the only one, but we'll see. I only can hope that people see that this isn't a political left-right issue.
And do you happen to see this potentially becoming a model for the rest of the country?
I hope so. I hope that other states realize that state sovereignty is real. We don't have to simply roll over and bend to the will of the federal government. And we can help fight to protect our businesses. This isn't just the individuals. I get calls from business owners. They do not want to mandate the COVID-19 vaccine. They're afraid it's going to put them out of business. And so here, I want to pass legislation so that the state of New Hampshire can do the fighting for the people and the businesses to protect them.
Now, what are you hearing from these business owners? One argument that I've been hearing is that they could not only lose their workers, but also their investment that they've put into these workers for so many years. And a lot of times the experience of veteran employees is invaluable. What other things are you hearing?
Both of those, that they're afraid of losing certainly amounts of people, and that they would not be able to still function, but yet also the talent, right? These are people with highly skilled jobs sometimes, or have just been there for so long that they simply can't function their business without certain individuals. And then we have sort of an added issue in New Hampshire in that a long time ago we passed a law saying that any sort of like testing, for instance, that's mandated by an employer has to be paid for by the employer, which normally, when you don't have the Biden mandates hanging over you, seems reasonable, right? If you're going to require something, you should have to pay for it. But now we have these businesses, they're telling me it's going to cost them $1.5 million a year to do the testing for the OSHA requirement, and that simply will put them out of business.
New Hampshire State Representative Melissa Blazek, thank you.
Thank you.
And 15 Republican governors have launched Operation Open Road, an initiative that seeks to ease America's supply chain crunch. Led by Tennessee Governor Bill Lee, the effort will use state and federal measures, including calling on the Biden administration to remove what they call burdensome regulations on the trucking industry. This includes lowering the age of commercial driver's license holders from 21 to 18, a review and revision of federal policies deterring use or domestic manufacture of essential transportation equipment, and a suspension of President Joe Biden's vaccine mandate for private employers. There have been 200 homicides in Washington, D.C. so far this year. The last time D.C. had so many homicides was back in 2003. According to D.C. police, crime has continued to be on the rise this year. There were 198 homicides in 2020 and 166 in 2019. Meanwhile, Maryland Governor Larry Hogan made a series of announcements on Tuesday to address violent crime in the city of Baltimore.
The murders, shootings, and out-of-control violent crime in the streets of Baltimore.
Baltimore has surpassed 300 homicides for the 7th year in a row. So far, the Hogan administration has committed more than $1 billion to public safety and crime control efforts in the city of Baltimore. Texas Democrat Eddie Bernice Johnson announces retirement after serving close to 3 decades in Congress. The 85-year-old said that she will endorse a female candidate to replace her, but would not endorse anyone who has been rejected by the district. It is likely she meant the woman who opposed her in previous primaries. Former President Donald Trump endorsed Delegate Dan Cox for governor of Maryland, putting him in the national spotlight. In a tweet, Trump said Cox was an American first patriot. Trump also added his opponent, Kelly Schultz, was handpicked by Governor Larry Hogan, who he describes as, quote, terrible for the country and against the America First agenda. And that's all we have for you on the Capitol Report today. Thank you for tuning in. From all of our team here at the Capitol Report and NTD, we want to wish you a very happy Thanksgiving. I'm your host, Steve Lance, and we'll see you next time.